They thought they could send private security to drag me off my own land like I was some squatter squatting on government property, but they didn't realize who they were dealing with, and more importantly, they had no clue this ranch had been in my family for generations, since before the lake had even been mapped by the state. So when those men showed up at the break of dawn, wearing black uniforms with oversized sunglasses and carrying clipboards like they were marshals of the land, all I saw was the beginning of a fight they were bound to lose, not because I was violent, but because I was ready, and because my son, an off-duty federal agent, happened to be visiting that week. Before I get into how the HOA's private security ended up on their knees apologizing, and how we turned a neighborhood power grab into a full-blown investigation, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories, because this tale only gets crazier from here, and you don't want to miss the justice that followed. It all started on a Tuesday morning, around 6:45 a.m. The mist from the lake still hugged the edges of the shoreline, and our dog, Buck, was chasing dragonflies near the front porch. I was sipping my coffee, enjoying the last bit of quiet before starting fence repairs along the south edge, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel, a sound that shouldn't have been there. We don't get unexpected visitors. Not at that hour. Not at all. I stepped out with my coffee and saw a black SUV with Lakefront Security Patrol in bold white letters parked at the gate. Two men stepped out, both dressed like corporate bouncers, tactical. Boots, utility belts, radios crackling. They approached slowly, holding what looked like a printed eviction notice in some binder. "You need to vacate this property immediately," the taller one said, without so much as a good morning. "Are in violation of Lakeview HOA, Regulation 9.3, Section B, non-compliant ownership transition." I stared at him, confused, not by the jargon, but by the audacity. "This property isn't part of your HOA," I told him. "Never has been. If you bothered to check county records, you'd know that." He smirked. "That's been revised. As of this month, your parcel falls within the extended boundary of Lakeview Property Owners Association. You were notified." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was pathetic. "I've owned this land for 31 years. You think you can just redraw lines and claim it like this is some monopoly board?" The second guy shifted uncomfortably, but the taller one pressed on. "We're authorized to remove you today, unless you comply." That was when my son Alex stepped out from the side of the barn, towel over his shoulder from his morning jog, clearly hearing enough of the conversation to get concerned. "Problem here?" he asked, keeping his tone even but his stance direct. The taller guy turned. "This is private HOA enforcement business, sir. Please stand back." That was mistake number one. Alex doesn't stand back, not when his father's being threatened. Not when property rights are being trampled. Certainly not when someone in a knockoff uniform thinks they can play sheriff. "You're trespassing," Alex said calmly. "This land is not part of your jurisdiction. You've delivered no legal order, and your presence here is already a civil violation. Possibly criminal if this escalates." The taller guy puffed his chest. "Sir, we are within our rights," but he didn't finish, because Alex pulled his ID wallet from the jogger's waistband and flashed a badge none of them were expecting. FBI, plain as day. Now here's where it got interesting. The shorter man, suddenly pale, took a step back. "We were just following orders," he stammered. "We thought," but the taller one still had that stupid smirk. Even as his hand twitched by his belt like he thought about calling someone, Alex stepped forward. "Let me be clear. You are unlawfully attempting to remove a citizen from private land not under your authority. That's impersonation of law enforcement if you escalate this, and trespassing already stands." I added, "I suggest you get off my land before we have county sheriffs here asking questions you can't answer." They hesitated. Moment the line where bluff meets consequence. And they blinked. They backed off, muttered something about returning with documentation, and drove off. We got their license plate, took photos of the vehicle, and Alex was already on the phone with a contact in the bureau by the time. The taillights disappeared over the hill. The rest of that day passed with a strange tension. We didn't know if they'd return, or if this was just some power flex by the HOA to scare us off. But when I dug through the mail pile in our hallway that night, I found a folded letter postmarked 2 weeks earlier. No envelope. Just taped shut, signed by none other than HOA President Meredith Langley. It read like a threat disguised as a welcome. Per recent territorial adjustments voted unanimously by the Lakeview HOA Board. Your property now falls under our oversight. You are expected to comply with all regulations by July 1st or risk legal enforcement action. No explanation of how they had the authority to extend their borders. No mention of consent or grandfathered properties, just a bold authoritarian assumption that because they drew a new map, our ranch now belonged under their control. That was their second mistake. Meredith Langley, I later found out, had built her HOA kingdom like a spider's web slowly, patiently weaving policy and bylaws so tight most folks didn't even realize they were being trapped until it was too late. Her tactic was simple: use fear, overwhelm people with technicalities, and target families who lived just far enough from legal counsel that they didn't fight back. But she didn't count on someone like me or on someone like Alex who had the resources, knowledge, and motivation to not only defend but dismantle everything she thought she had built. The next morning, I drove into town and pulled the most recent county zoning maps from the assessor's office. My parcel hadn't moved an inch. The HOA's new territory map was unofficial, unrecorded, and unenforceable. Where did their authority come from? I found out the answer later that week, and it was even worse than I thought. Meredith had been bribing one of the county clerks with favors, influence, and in one case, an underdatable payment that showed up as a consulting fee on a tax return. That's when Alex knew we had more than a rogue HOA on our hands. We had a criminal operation masked in neighborhood rules. He started digging through public records, connecting dots between Meredith's real estate acquisitions, fake citations, against elderly residents, and dozens of forced property sales that followed a disturbing pattern, and he found it. Meredith had been orchestrating a silent property grab for nearly 5 years, absorbing lakefront homes into her HOA bubble, inciting owners into submission until they sold for cheap or left entirely. What she wanted was our land. What she got was a federal investigation. That was just the beginning. The moment Alex confirmed Meredith Langley's network of property seizures wasn't just aggressive policy, it was a deliberate, mapped-out racket. We knew we were up against something far deeper than petty HOA overreach, and I realized this. It wasn't just about saving my land anymore. It was about making sure she never did this to anyone else again. We contacted a real estate attorney, a sharp woman named Gwen Halley. Dealt with HOA abuse cases before and wasn't afraid to push back hard. She met us at the ranch that afternoon, looked over every document, then said something I'll never forget. She's not a president. She's a predator. Gwen explained how some HOAs, especially unregulated ones in growing towns, turned into land-flipping machines. Board members like Meredith would redraw boundaries unofficially, use fines and intimidation to wear homeowners down, then offer to help them exit their properties quickly before selling them to developers or rental firms for triple the price. She also explained that most victims never fought back because they didn't understand their rights, or they were elderly, or because no one believed that something with the word homeowners in it could act like a cartel. That night, Alex and Gwen worked side by side to draft an injunction request to block any further action against my land while I drove to the neighboring ranches, knocking on doors and telling them what had happened. What surprised me most wasn't how scared they was how many of them had stories just like mine, a fake notice taped to their door, strangers showing up taking measurements without consent, sudden zoning adjustments that didn't exist on any official record. One man, Harold Sutton, a retired firefighter, showed me a letter nearly identical to mine, same font, same signature, same thread about transition compliance, but he'd been so worn down by repeated noise complaints and citations for having unauthorized livestock that he gave up and sold 2 acres to Meredith's LLC. Another woman, Marisol, said her security cameras caught a man pouring motor oil into her flower beds days before an inspection that led to a $1,200 fine for hazardous landscaping. The deeper I asked, the darker it got. Alex documented every story, time-stamped each statement, and Gwen cross-checked every violation notice to confirm they weren't just illegal, they were fabricated. And right as we were compiling everything into a complaint package for the state attorney general, something happened that made it all feel like a scene from a crime drama. At 2:12 a.m. on Friday morning, our motion-triggered security lights flipped on. Alex was already awake, sipping coffee and reviewing emails in the kitchen. When he saw them, three dark figures on the surveillance monitor creeping along our north fence line, clearly trying to avoid detection. We'd installed floodlights and infrared cameras after the HOA's first visit, and thankfully, Alex had also wired them to send real-time footage to cloud storage. He watched one man lift a bolt cutter to the gate padlock, while another pulled out what looked like a folded eviction paper again. Alex didn't wait. He grabbed his badge, his Glock, and radioed the local sheriff's dispatch, giving them our address and code red status. I joined him on the porch as he calmly called out, "This is federal property, and you are on private land. Stand down immediately." Two of the intruders froze. The third ran. Within 10 minutes, Sheriff's Department arrived and detained the men. Turns out they were hired by a private compliance contractor associated with Lakeview HOA. But none of them had licenses for enforcement, and one of them had a record for impersonating an officer back in Nevada. This wasn't just HOA intimidation anymore, this was crossing into criminal conspiracy. The sheriff, who'd been skeptical until now, saw the footage, read the so-called eviction notice, and started shaking his head. "This ain't code enforcement," he muttered. "This is a shakedown." Alex handed him the list of suspicious property transfers Gwen had helped us compile, and by morning, the sheriff called in a regional investigator. Within 48 hours, Meredith Langley was served a subpoena for all HOA communications, board meeting minutes, and property acquisition records. She didn't respond directly, but she made her next move obvious. The following Monday, she showed up at the edge of our driveway in a bright red Lexus, wearing oversized sunglasses and flanked by two younger board members who looked like they'd walked off the set of some corporate reality show. She didn't approach the porch, just stood by the hood and shouted, "You're making a mistake getting lawyers involved, Mr. Hawthorne. You have no idea what this could mean for you." I walked down to the gate slowly, opened it, and replied, "You're right. I had no idea how deep this went until you tried to send men in the night to scare my family off our own land." One of her lackeys said something about how the HOA is just doing its duty, but I held up my phone, already recording. "You want to keep talking? Make sure the sheriff hears it too." Meredith's smile disappeared. She backed into her car, slammed the door, and drove off. That video? It went viral. Alex posted it to a homeowner's rights forum, and within hours, it had been shared across multiple platforms. Other victims began reaching out from different counties, some even from other states, describing eerily similar tactics: sudden boundary expansions, fake notices, security threats, and forced property sales tied to shell companies. Gwen coordinated with several lawyers to form a temporary legal alliance, and together they compiled a formal federal complaint. Meredith wasn't just running a corrupt HOA, she was coordinating a network of land theft operations disguised as enforcement policy. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, we were finally granted a court date to contest the HOA's legitimacy over our property. Alex prepared a full presentation of security footage, legal inconsistencies, and financial trails tied to Meredith's development company. And I took care of the neighbors, building a coalition of witnesses who would stand with us on hearing day. And yet, in the middle of all this, we never stopped living. I kept working the land, fixing that broken fence, feeding the livestock. Because that's what she never understood. This ranch wasn't just property, it was legacy, history. It had seen more storms than she ever would. As the court date neared, we received one final letter from the HOA, this time not taped to the door, but hand-delivered in an unmarked envelope. And inside was a single sentence typed in bold: "Last chance to withdraw your complaint, walk away now." Alex laughed out loud when he read it. Looks like she's the one sweating now. And he was right. The tide was turning, and Meredith Langley had no idea that her days of unchecked power were about to crash harder than she ever imagined. The day we stepped into the county courthouse, I felt the weight of 100 years of history resting on my shoulders. Because this wasn't just about proving a point anymore. It was about protecting the legacy of everyone who had ever called this ranch home, starting with my great-grandfather who first cleared these trees before electricity had even reached this side of the county. The courtroom was packed tighter than I'd expected. Our neighbors had shown up in droves, many of them having driven hours just to stand and watch, their faces lined with a mix of hope, fear, and quiet anger. Word had spread quickly once Meredith Langley's name started circulating on public forums. Her reputation, once guarded behind manicured social media profiles and local real estate newsletters, was being dragged into the light, and it wasn't pretty. She sat at the defense table, dressed like she was auditioning for a corporate magazine cover power red blazer. Gold earrings that caught the light just enough to distract, but there was a visible crack in her poise. Her eyes darted around the room like she hadn't expected this much heat. On our side, Alex stood beside Gwen Halley, armed with a stack of evidence so dense it took 3 boxes to carry it all in. The judge, an older man named Riley, with a reputation for no nonsense. Justice opened proceedings and immediately demanded to know how Lakeview HOA had the authority to redraw zoning boundaries without formal county approval. Meredith's attorney, a smug man who looked like he practiced intimidation, in a mirror stood up and mumbled something about adaptive policy zones and emergency environmental reevaluation. But Judge Riley wasn't buying it. "The fluff, counselor," he said. "This isn't an HOA boardroom where you can invent terms and expect applause. Show me the ordinance. Show me the vote." When it became clear there was no actual documentation supporting the boundary change, the courtroom shifted. You could feel the collective gasp, a wave of people realizing in real time that their worst fears had been true all along. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate manipulation. Gwen laid out everything. Meredith's forged property, maps, the fake notices printed on HOA letterhead but not recorded anywhere, and the nighttime trespassing incidents documented by Alex's drone footage. Then Alex took the floor. He didn't raise his voice or try to impress anyone. He just told the truth, badge and all. He explained how he traced the financial connections between the Lakeview HOA board and a shell company called Ravenlight Acquisitions, which had been purchasing lots at far below market rate shortly after the owners were bombarded with false violations. Then he dropped the bombshell. "We have federal confirmation," he said, handing over a document with a seal on it, "that Ravenlight is under investigation in 3 states for real estate fraud, and Miss Langley sits on their advisory board." The room erupted. Meredith's attorney jumped up, shouting objection. But Judge Riley waved him off. "Sit down, counselor. I want to see that document." He read through it slowly, eyes narrowing with every line, then looked directly at Meredith. "You are aware that lying under oath is a felony, Miss Langley?" She didn't respond. Her face had gone pale. Her hands trembled slightly, just enough to betray the iceberg melting beneath her posture. The judge turned to us. "Mr. Hawthorne, do you wish to make a final statement?" I nodded and stood, suddenly aware that every eye in the room was on me. I didn't need a speech. I just spoke from the gut. "This land has been in my family since before any of you were born. It's not just a home, it's our history. And for the past 6 months, we've been bullied, threatened, and almost robbed because someone wanted to play queen of a lake that doesn't belong to her. This isn't about rules. This is about greed. I'm asking this court to do what's right, not just for me, but for every single family that's been hurt by this HOA." Judge Riley sat back, hands folded, then nodded. "I'll have a ruling by the end of the week." And the gavel dropped. We walked out of that courtroom with a strange sense of both victory and anticipation. It wasn't over yet, but we knew. We'd shaken the foundation of Meredith's empire. What we didn't know was just how fast it would crumble. 2 days later, the sheriff's office raided the Lakeview HOA headquarters, a glassy building with marble floors that Meredith liked. To call the command center, they walked out with computers, documents, and hard drives. News vans showed up within hours. Reporters staked out the property, filming every box loaded into the patrol cars. It hit the local news first, then regional, then national lines. Like HOA fraud ring busted and fake security, real crimes were suddenly everywhere. Residents of Lakeview who'd once blindly followed Meredith were now organizing a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely. And the final nail? Meredith herself was arrested on charges of wire fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. I'll never forget seeing her being led out in handcuffs, still wearing that red blazer, but this time without the smug smile. The woman who thought she could redraw a map and erase our family's history ended up erasing her own freedom instead. In the weeks that followed, things returned to a strange kind of normal. Alex returned to Washington, but called every day. Gwen became something of a local hero. And me? I spent my mornings walking the edge of our land, remembering what it had cost to keep it safe. But there was one last thing to be done. Something I'd promised myself from the beginning. The ranch deserved better than to live in fear of paper pushers with badges. So I called the county, filed the paperwork, and legally applied to make our ranch a historical homestead. And this time, no one objected. The historical homestead designation didn't just protect my ranch from future HOA threats, it lit a fire in the hearts of everyone around Lakeview who had once felt powerless against Meredith Langley and her crooked empire. And as soon as the news hit the local paper, I started receiving calls, letters, and even hand-delivered pies from neighbors who said things like, "You saved my home, and now I know I'm not crazy." It was humbling. I didn't set out to become a symbol of resistance. I just wanted peace. But sometimes peace only comes after a fight, and I was starting to see that what had happened at my ranch was just the tip of something much bigger. Alex had kept in close touch with the federal agents investigating Ravenlight acquisitions, and they confirmed that the Lakeview case was one of 4 nearly identical scams unfolding across 3 states. The method was always the same. Form an HOA, rewrite policies without oversight, then use legal-sounding notices and intimidation to force people off their land. The profits were staggering. In Lakeview alone, Ravenlight's paper trail showed nearly $12 million in flipped properties. With kickbacks routed to shell companies controlled by HOA board members, Meredith wasn't a rogue agent, she was part of a system. And now, thanks to the footage, court testimony, and documentation we'd gathered, that system was unraveling. The town council reached out to me as Meonda asked if I'd be willing to speak at a community summit on property rights and HOA abuse. I almost laughed when they said it. I'm a rancher, not a public speaker, but I couldn't say no, not after everything. I spent days working with Gwen and Alex on what to say, and when the day finally came, I stood in front of a packed community center with my boots still dusty and my hands shaking like I was back in high school giving a speech. I'm not here to play hero, I told them. I'm just a man who nearly lost his family's land because someone decided they wanted it more than we did. But I fought back. And you can too. I told them everything about the forged documents, the fake security team, the false citations. I showed them the court files, the video recordings, and the proof of Ravenlight's shady transactions. People gasped. Some cried. When I finished, they gave me a standing ovation that nearly brought me to tears. That same week, county issued a motion to place a temporary freeze on all HOA-related property enforcement actions pending state review. Meredith's face was still showing up in the news, but now the headlines were calling her the queen of HOA corruption and following her trial like it was a celebrity scandal. She'd hired a crisis PR firm, of course. But it couldn't erase the footage of her threatening me at my own gate, or the court records tying her to shell companies. With her gone and the HOA's power under state scrutiny, Lakeview began to change. The neighbors who had once whispered behind closed doors started speaking openly. Old fences were mended, community cookouts returned, and at one of those potlucks, a retired Marine named Carl approached me and said, "You didn't just stop them. You reminded us this was still our town." That meant more than anything. There was still unfinished business. During the investigation, Alex discovered that one of Meredith's hired security contractors, one of the guys who tried to cut my lock that night, had a pending warrant in another county for assault and extortion. When we asked why the HOA hired him, it became clear Meredith didn't care about qualifications, only obedience. That meant other HOAs might be using the same people. So Alex reached out to his contacts and proposed something bold, forming a national database of unlicensed enforcers and known HOA-linked shell companies to help other communities spot red flags before they were blindsided. He called it the Property Integrity Watchdog Network, or PIWN. I offered to fund the first 6 months myself, and Gwen pitched in her time pro bono to build out the legal framework. Within a month, PIWN had over 500 entries and was being used by communities in Arizona, Texas, and Florida. But not everyone was thrilled. Just when we thought the dust had settled, I received a letter no return address, no signature containing a single printed sentence. You think you won, but the game is bigger than you. It rattled me more than I expected. I showed it to Alex, and he immediately set up an encrypted communication line with his former agency, suggesting we might have stepped on toes bigger than Meredith's. He wasn't wrong. As PIWN gained attention, we began noticing attempts to discredit our work online. Anonymous accounts claimed we were anti-community, anti-growth, and even domestic agitators. Gwen traced the IP addresses behind some of these posts and discovered they were linked to PR firms with ties to developers and national HOA lobbying organizations. These weren't just trolls. They were part of a strategy to silence us. If there's one thing this ranch has taught me, it's that you can't be afraid of storms. You just brace yourself, anchor deep, and ride it out. We doubled down. I went back on local radio, did 2 TV interviews, and even agreed to appear on a national podcast about property rights. The more they tried to smear us, the more people started listening. Real families, real landowners. People who'd been bullied, tricked, or pushed out. We gave them tools, language, and above all, proof that they weren't alone. Lakeview, once just a sleepy HOA on Lakefront community, was now the center of a growing movement. We hosted town halls, set up workshops. Gwen led legal seminars, explaining what a lawful HOA notice actually looked like versus a fake one. Alex trained people on basic surveillance, how to document harassment, and how to properly escalate to authorities. It was like watching a town heal from the inside out. And through it all, the ranch stood unchanged, unmoved, a living reminder of everything we fought to protect. I installed a new flagpole near the front fence, flying the state flag below Old Glory, beneath it. I added a small bronze sign that read, "Here we hold the line." Not because we hate HOAs or laws, but because we believe that power must answer to truth. And if the people with boots in the dirt don't speak up, someone in an office tower will always try to draw new lines. Meredith Langley thought she could redraw mine. Instead, she reminded me why some lines can never be crossed. The real shift came not from the courtroom win or the federal investigation, but from the way our community began to stand up for itself in ways we hadn't seen in decades. And I realized that for every Meredith Langley trying to manipulate policy and bulldoze people with paperwork, there were a dozen everyday citizens just waiting for permission to push back, to raise their voice, to reclaim the ground beneath their feet. And that permission came when someone stood up first, even if it was just one rancher who refused to be dragged out of his own land. The Property Integrity Watchdog Network PIW grew faster than we imagined. Gwen and Alex had hired 2 assistants just to handle the volume of reports flooding in from homeowners, neighborhood councils, and even whistleblowers within existing HOAs. The stories they shared were terrifying in their similarity, trumped up. Violations, arbitrary fines, locked gates, fake emergency letters, even cameras mounted secretly on private property. PIWN became a hub, a lifeline, and with it came something we didn't expect: traction with state legislators. A senator from Texas asked if we'd testify during a hearing on HOA overreach. Then a representative from Colorado invited us to help draft new protections for legacy landowners. And just like that, what began as a local fight to save a lakefront ranch became a national push to restore property rights. I remember sitting on my porch with a mug of coffee, watching the sun rise over the water, when Alex read me an email aloud from a woman in Florida. She'd seen the interview we did on a podcast and realized the violations she was being hit with matched the exact same template used in Lakeview. "You saved me from losing my home," she wrote. "You don't even know me, but you gave me back my dignity." I didn't reply, but I kept that email printed in my desk drawer. Because when the noise got loud, when the anonymous threats kept coming, when people started calling me a troublemaker, or worse, it reminded me why I kept going, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't getting tired. The fight had consumed my entire life. The ranch still needed attention. The fences still needed mending. The roof on the barn still leaked after heavy storms. But my days were full of calls, conferences, interviews, and legal reviews. Gwen warned me that burnout was real, and she was right. I started dreaming of simpler days, of nights around the fire with just the crackle of the logs and the sound of crickets. Not political podcasts or legal debates. That's when it happened. Late one evening, Alex called with a tone I hadn't heard since the day he showed up with drone footage and a case file serious. Focused and urgent. "We've got something," he said. "Bigger than anything we've seen yet." A new HOA was forming just 2 counties over, but this one wasn't being led by real neighbors. It was being built from scratch by a real estate firm using investors with fake local addresses to pose as residents. They'd already bought up 6 properties under different names, changed the zoning rules by filing a loophole clause, and were about to issue a series of mandatory assessments that would force the remaining families to either pay up or lose their property rights. "It's Lakeview all over again," Alex said. "Ow!" But this time, they're moving faster, smarter. We didn't hesitate. We loaded up documents, set up meetings, and organized a town hall for the affected families. They were skeptical at first, burned too many times to trust anyone, but when we showed them the timeline, the transaction logs, and the shell company ownership structure, you could see the moment it clicked. "They're trying to erase us," one woman whispered, tears in her eyes, "just like they tried to erase you." That night, 53 families signed a joint legal challenge. And by the end of the week, we had secured an injunction preventing the HOA from enacting any further rules pending a fraud investigation. It was another victory, but it came with a warning. These weren't just isolated cases. There was now a playbook and too many people willing to follow it. That's when we decided it was time to take the fight to the federal level. With a coalition of attorneys, lawmakers, and real estate watchdogs, to propose the Homeowners Fair Practices Act, a bill that would standardize HOA transparency requirements, mandate third-party audits, and establish a federal hotline for reporting abuses. It was ambitious, maybe even impossible, but we had to try. Meanwhile, the ranch remained my anchor. No matter how many battles we fought, how many hearings we attended, I always came back to that same porch, that same view, that same stretch of land my great-grandfather once rode horseback across when there wasn't a road for miles. I thought of him often, what he'd say about all this. Probably something simple like, "Don't let them steal what you built." And I wouldn't. Not now, not ever. One afternoon, while repairing a section of split-rail fencing near the northern edge of the property, I found something buried just beneath the topsoil, a rusted horseshoe, bent at the curve, still faintly stamped with a date from the early 1900s. I stood there for a long while, holding it in my hands, thinking about how many storms that horseshoe had weathered, how many miles it had traveled before being forgotten, and how much history lay under our feet. This land didn't just belong to me. It belonged to time, to memory, to those who came before and those who'd come after. And I would protect it with every breath, just like that old horseshoe, bent but never broken. The day the Homeowners Fair Practices Act was introduced to Congress, I was back at the ranch, clearing brush near the lake where the tree line dipped down into the shallows. And I didn't even know the bill had been filed until Gwen called, breathless and giddy, to tell me we'd made it to the floor with bipartisan sponsors and a list of endorsements longer than a hay wagon. And I remember dropping the limb I was holding and just standing there in silence as the wind came off the lake and rustled the reeds like applause from generations past, as if the land itself knew we were finally doing something that would last. That bill wouldn't undo what Meredith Langley did, and it wouldn't bring back the homes lost by those families before we intervened. But it would create a system where corruption had a harder time hiding behind bylaws and where homeowners Didn't have to hire private investigators just to understand their own mail. But the fight wasn't over. We still had powerful opposition, national real estate coalitions, investment firms, and yes, even some entrenched HOA associations that feared the loss of unchecked authority. The disinformation ramped up again. Anonymous blogs accused PIN of being a scam. Comment sections on our public posts filled with copy-pasted propaganda, calling us anti-progress anarchists and rural conspiracy theorists. It was almost laughable until we discovered a coordinated effort to discredit key members of our team. Gwen's legal credentials were challenged by an anonymous tipster who filed a formal complaint with the bar. Alex received a fake job offer from a shell company tied to a rival lobbying group, clearly meant to pull him away or tarnish his record. And me? I got audited. For the first time in my life, a full forensic audit triggered by a supposed community concern letter, claiming I was hiding income from the donations we'd collected for outreach events. It was all smoke and intimidation, and it didn't work. Gwen passed her bar review with flying colors. Alex exposed the fake offer and traced its funding back to a PAC tied to Ravenlight's parent company. And my audit? It confirmed I'd done nothing wrong and accidentally uncovered an accounting error that gave me a refund. Sometimes justice has a sense of humor. But the constant pressure wore on us. I started noticing how jumpy I'd become. How I'd scan every strange car parked too long near my property. How I'd answer the phone expecting another curveball. Gwen noticed too. You need a break? She said. The ranch needs you whole. Not half burnt, I knew she was right. So I stepped back from the front lines for a bit. I still checked in on PIWN, still answered emails from homeowners. But I stopped traveling, stopped speaking, and returned to what grounded me: mending fences, clearing paths, walking the boundary lines with my dog and a thermos of black coffee. And in that stillness, something happened I hadn't expected. The next generation stepped up. People we'd mentored began organizing in their own towns. New names started appearing in the headlines. One young woman in Kansas halted an HOA for closure. With only 3 days' notice, by quoting case law we'd published in our online resource library. A retired Navy chief in Nevada exposed a fraudulent citation racket and took over his entire HOA board with a team of vets. It was working. Our movement had roots. Meanwhile, Lakeview transformed. With Meredith Langley gone, the HOA board dissolved, and the town council voted to revert all enforcement authority back to county zoning. The community felt free again. Property values stabilized. People who had left returned. The general store reopened under new ownership, and someone even restored the old boathouse where kids used to dive off the dock in summer. And on one quiet Tuesday morning, the mayor stopped by the ranch with a small wooden plaque carved with the town seal and the words Lakeview Defender engraved beneath it. We thought you might hang it in the barn, he said, smiling. I didn't hang it there. I put it on the front porch right by the swing, where anyone who came by could see it. A reminder of what it costs to protect what matters. Then, just as things seemed to settle, a letter arrived hand-delivered. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a photo of a construction site, somewhere in the hills outside town. In the distance, I could just make out the shape of a large fence being built. Attached was a sticky note that said, "They're trying again." Alex confirmed it. Ravenlight's investors hadn't vanished. They just rebranded. New name, new LLC, but the same tactics. Buy land, form an HOA, rewrite rules, force, sales. This time, they were working through luxury eco-village developments, using greenwash language about sustainability and carbon. Offset credits to justify annexing adjoining lots and imposing fees on families that had been there for generations. The plan was bolder than before and nastier. The HOA documents we uncovered included language that allowed them to fine residents for visual disruption, meaning if your house didn't match their color palette or landscaping style, you could be charged hundreds per day. It was legal bullying at its most absurd. And the worst part? They were using AI-generated signatures to fabricate consent from fake residents, creating the illusion of community support. Gwen called it deepfake. Democracy. We had to act. I dusted off my boots, called Alex, and began assembling the same team that had saved Lakeview. But this time, we weren't just reacting. We were going on offense. We filed a federal injunction, citing digital fraud and community misrepresentation. We coordinated with the new Federal Property Ethics Office formed as a result of our bill, and we began door-knocking, talking to the real people, the ones being threatened with eviction or compliance fees just for having wind chimes or old sheds. These weren't numbers. They were stories, lives. I stood in the kitchen of a man who had built his house by hand and now faced losing it because his front porch wasn't eco-aligned. I met a woman whose father's grave was on land they'd lived on since 1890, now threatened by fines for unauthorized memorials. It made my blood boil. It reminded me why we had to win again. Because this wasn't about lakefront views or land value. It was about dignity, legacy, and the right to call a place home without fear that someone with a spreadsheet and a lawyer could erase it overnight. They sent security once. They tried to drag me out of my own land. But now they'd have to answer to something they couldn't push around. A movement. An informed public, growing storm of resistance. And I was right in the middle of it once more. The lawsuit landed in federal court just as the Eco-Village's PR campaign launched in full swing. With social media influencers being paid to promote ethical community living and lifestyle, magazines featuring drone shots of eco-homes, nestled in artificial harmony along the edge of a legally zoned wilderness. And if I hadn't known better, I'd have thought it was a utopia. But beneath the glossy brochures and utopian marketing, it was the same old scheme, wrapped in recycled wood. Our legal challenge had teeth this time. Digital fraud, zoning, manipulation, falsified community votes. Even forged permits in with the Federal Property Ethics Office now fully operational thanks to the very bill we helped push. Investigators who finally had the authority to act. Within 3 weeks, the development was frozen by court order. No new homes could be built, no fees collected, no compliance letters mailed. We'd stop them again. But it was the public response that surprised me most. People from across the country began submitting their own HOA horror stories to PIWN's online platform. We received thousands of stories of abuse, extortion, silencing, and in some cases, outright property theft. Alex and Gwen worked non-stop triaging, sorting, documenting. What began as a grassroots network now had the infrastructure of a legal firm and the agility of a tech startup. I walked outside one night, past the old barn, past the lake, and looked up at the stars. They were the same stars my grandfather used to point out to me from the back of his old tractor. Orion, the Big Dipper, the North Star, he'd say, "Those don't move, son. They guide you home." That night, I realized our story wasn't about one man, one ranch, or one bad HOA. It was about preserving a compass for people everywhere who felt lost in the legal mess and intimidation tactics that too often governed where they lived. We became that compass. A week later, I got a call from a production company. They wanted to make a documentary about the HOA resistance movement and our story in Lakeview. I laughed, told them I wasn't interested in being a celebrity. But Gwen elbowed me and said, "You don't have to be a star. Just be yourself." The film crew arrived in April, and over the course of 2 weeks, they captured every Think Court hearings, drone footage, town hall meetings, even old photos of my great-grandfather building the first fence posts with little more than a hammer and a dream. When they asked what I wanted to say to the camera, I paused and thought about it long and hard. Then I said, "We don't need perfect neighborhoods. We need fair ones." That quote ended up in the final cut, and when the documentary aired, something happened that I'll never forget. Kids from our local high school started a civics club. Not a football team, not a dance troupe, a civics club. They wanted to learn about property rights, public policy, and how to stop being afraid of authority. One girl, no older than 16, told me she planned to become a property attorney because of what happened here. She said, "I want to make sure no one loses their home just because they can't afford to fight." That moment made everything worth it. Every legal battle, every media attack, every threat. It was never just about the land. It was about what the land represented: freedom, roots, and the ability to say, "This is mine and you can't take it." I still live on the ranch. The porch swing creaks in the wind just like always. The lake still catches the light at dawn like a mirror of fire. Sometimes people drive by and wave. Sometimes they stop and ask questions. I answer them all. I always end with the same words: don't let anyone write your story for you. Meredith Langley thought she could write our ending. She thought security guards, phony violations, and fake votes could erase a century of family history. But we wrote the next chapter. If you're listening, watching, or reading this now, so can you? Start where you are. Speak up. Know your rights. And when the bullies come knocking, don't open the door. Make sure they crawl back to where they came from. This is your land. This is your life. No HOA, no corporation, no bully can take it unless you let them. We didn't let them. And now we're the ones setting the rules. If this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes to how real this fight is, then do one simple thing right now. Subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel so you never miss a true story of justice, grit, and standing your ground. We tell stories that matter, stories they don't want you to hear. Be part of the movement. Be part of the resistance. And most of all, never stop fighting for your land. Because once it's gone forever.